Okay, this lesson 10, is going to be looking at the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1851. I will say that the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1851 is a massive part of the course. It is really, really fundamental that you understand this treaty. Number one, you understand what the terms of this treaty were between white Americans and the Native Americans, but also its consequences. So what happens as a result of it, and its significance, why it's so important, what its impact is. And it is all down to really the relations between the white Americans and the Plains Indians as well. So that's a really, really important part that we're looking at here. Okay, so main things to consider: the significance of the Fort Laramie Treaty. So just as a quick recap, so obviously lessons 8 and 9 looked at the Mormon migration, so that kind of settlement of the West, and lesson 9 looked at law and order. This is going back to that theme of the Native Americans and the white Americans. So what we've got here as a quick starter is for you to kind of go over the main events that take place from 1830 to 1851, which kind of changed the landscape of the American West, and it tells us a lot about the attitudes and why the policy of the US government changed towards the West. As we know, we always go back to that idea that in the 1820s and 30s, many white Americans didn't have a desire to go west, to migrate west. They saw that land as inhospitable. They saw it as being the Great American Desert, a land with a harsh climate and harsh environment. We know that changes, and so this idea is just a recap, so we'll quickly go over this. We did this through interactive learning. So 1830, the President Jackson, US President Jackson at the time, he decides that he doesn't want Native Americans being on the eastern side of the Mississippi River, shown here by this blue line. So if you may remember, he forcibly removes around 46,000 Native Americans west of the Mississippi. It becomes known as the Trail of Tears, and many hundreds of Native Americans die on the journey. They're not used to that kind of journey. But it kind of is evidence that the white Americans, they don't want any sort of interaction. So the Indian Removal Act is the idea of removing Native Americans who were living here on the west of the Mississippi River. 4 years later, the permanent Indian frontier is declared. Think about what the word permanent means. It means forever. And a frontier is a boundary, is a border. So that is agreed, and it's not necessarily a kind of wall. It's kind of a series of fortifications that go along around this area here, kind of splitting east and west. There's also the Intercourse and Trade Act, which bans the kind of selling of alcohol and guns to Native Americans as well. Again, further evidence that the white Americans did not want interaction. It's an idea of segregation, really, between white Americans and Native Americans. They don't want to interact or trade. But the situation changes very quickly in the 1840s. In 1845, Texas becomes part of the United States, officially joins the United States. So this southern area here is now becoming part of the United States, the USA. In 1846, up here, Oregon had been under control of the British, and the British give up the territory of Oregon. They give that to the USA and becomes a part of the United States. And then finally, in 1848, there was a war between the USA and Mexico. And at that time, Mexico controlled many areas around here, which we now know as Arizona and California. They then succeed themselves to the United States. So we know that from that period of time here in the 1830s, where there's this idea of segregation and boundaries between the white Americans and Native Americans, quickly changes in the 1840s with that acquisition of territory. Now the United States almost surrounds the Native American territory. The Native Americans are here in the middle, on the Great Plains. There is now a reason to go west. This new territory in Oregon and California, and we know that it's great farmland and things like the gold rush as well. So the United States start to push this idea of manifest destiny that we looked at, this God-given right that white Americans should colonize and settle the whole of the American continent, from east, the Atlantic Ocean over here, all the way to the west and the Pacific over here. Kind of comes to a head in 1851 when the US government signed the Indian Appropriation Act. And what this does is this sets funding aside to place Native Americans onto reservations. Reservations being those designated bits of land for Native Americans. And this is going to be the beginning of the process of what we call assimilation. So assimilating a culture is making them like you. Ultimately, the white Americans want to make the Native Americans like them. They want the Native Americans to farm the land. They want the Native Americans to become civilized in their minds. So the Appropriations Act in 1851 puts that money aside to start that process. So that leads us to some of the increase in tension then. So you've got, before the 1840s, there are settlers going west, and in 1836 the Oregon Trail is set up, but you haven't really got waves upon waves of migrants travelling. All changes in the 1840s when there is a reason to go west, and naturally conflict is going to arise between white American settlers and migrants and the Native Americans in their tribes. So the knowledge that you've gained about the Native Americans and how their tribes work and chiefs and their kind of attitude towards warfare and hunting will become really helpful here. So this activity is quite straightforward, it's pretty quick, and in the middle here you've got a series of events that take place that kind of exacerbate tensions between the white Americans and Native Americans. Remember, exacerbate is that word that means to make things worse. The first one's done for you, and all you need to do is really just use arrows to kind of link them to whichever box it's relevant to. So the first box here, from the 1820s and 1830s, white migrants, began to use the Oregon Trail, as we've already mentioned, to travel across the Great Plains. So we kind of want to identify the impact of that. So here's the arrow to this box here. So the movement of white migrants west brought disease such as smallpox. We know that from the medicine course. It devastated the Native American tribes, and there was an epidemic of smallpox across the Great Plains in the 1830s, late 1830s. The Native Americans weren't used to these diseases. These were European diseases. They weren't immune to them. So that goes to that one. This one here, discovery of gold. We've talked about this a lot. But the California gold rush meant that tens of thousands of migrants used the Oregon Trail to head west. So what you want to think here is, right, which box does this link to? Well, this one here, look. The increased number of migrants disrupted the Native American hunting season. So you then want to have an arrow going from that box down to that one here. So the buffalo started to get scared off, and obviously that had a huge impact upon the Native Americans' ability to hunt. So you just get yourself a little arrow and put it towards this one over here. Read through the other three boxes and link them to which impact do they link to? Is it pressure on grass? Is it getting caught up in tribal warfare? Is it disease? Is it disrupting hunting season? Okay, so they're the tensions, and ultimately these tensions are all going to lead to the US government having to sign a treaty, because ultimately what's happening is more and more migrants are traveling west. It's kind of exacerbating tensions between Native Americans and white Americans. Native American tribes are attacking migrants. Something has to be done. So the US government decided to sign this treaty with the Native American chiefs and tribes. It's called the Fort Laramie Treaty. Fort Laramie is a place. It's just east of the Rocky Mountains. If you think about the map of the American West, and it's ultimately where they gathered to sign this treaty. So a lot of the chiefs from a lot of the major tribes, like the Sioux, were invited um, to sign this treaty. It is worth noting that a lot of the chiefs didn't really understand what they were signing, though, which is going to be problematic. But we'll delve into that a bit more when we realise what the terms for the Native Americans were, because that's what a treaty is. You have terms, and both sides have to abide by those terms, and if they don't, there is usually consequences. So the way the activity works is you've got the main terms here. So this one is the Native Americans. So this is what the Native Americans had to agree to. The other page is what the US government had to agree to, and immediately I hope you can notice that there are far fewer terms for the United States government than there are the Native Americans. So already you can tell that this treaty is going to be one-sided. On the page here, you have some of the main terms for the treaty to help you, but it's about trying to work out, using the image, trying to work out what that term that was, but I will go through them with you. So we've got the term of the treaty, and then you've got what that led to, and ultimately what we want you to do is to then explain the significance of it. So the first one here, a key really concept of Native American society is warfare. The Fort Laramie Treaty demanded that the Native Americans stopped their tribal warfare. It's a big ask, part of their culture, part of the warrior society, the dog soldiers in the Cheyenne, the Kit Foxes in the Sioux. So it was quite a big ask really to do this. And the idea was, it was kind of the US government were trying to prevent and stop their way of life and stop their culture. They saw it as savage. Remember, they saw the kind of idea of scalping and mutilation as being barbaric and savage. So they're trying to stop it. However, the Native Americans did continue to fight each other. They weren't one people. They were lots of different tribes, and fighting each other was all about, it's part of their society. So whenever they did it, the US government used this as an excuse to say that the Native Americans were breaking the treaty. The Native Americans had to allow migrants to cross, so they weren't allowed to attack any migrants as well. Again, that's a problem, because these migrants going over with their huge wagons and their oxen were kind of putting pressure on the grass and putting pressure on the buffalo hunting grounds as well. And what you found as well is sometimes migrants didn't always stick to the Oregon Trail, and they would actually go into kind of areas designated for the Native Americans, and again, this caused problems. Box 3 and Box 4 are kind of similar. The Native Americans had to agree that the US government could build railways, forts, and roads. Again, this is this idea of manifest destiny in action here. They're colonizing the West. The railroad and the Pacific Railroad will stretch from east to west, and what's that going to do? It's going to increase migration. It's going to increase settlement. It's going to prevent the Native Americans having the land in the middle that they need, and it's going to prevent that nomadic way of life. The railways are going to disrupt buffalo hunting grounds as well. So again, it's that steady progression of Americanization of the West, that colonizing the West with roads, forts, and railways. Finally, the Native Americans had to agree that if they broke any of these terms, they would have to pay compensation. So what's the long-term significance of this for the Native Americans? Well, they are having to agree to let the white Americans settle the West more and more. It's disrupting their way of life. They are allowing their kind of traditions to be attacked, and their main food source and their way of life with the buffalo is going to be massively disrupted. So the Fort Laramie Treaty is not a good thing for the Native Americans. Let's not forget that the US government have already set aside funding for reservations. The Fort Laramie Treaty will begin that process of putting them on to reservations as well. For the US government, so what they do is they agree to pay something called annuity. So you make an annual payment, annuity, and they agree to pay that to the different tribes. And they agree to pay $50,000 for 50 years to the Native Americans. It's a huge sum, but there's a problem. The Native Americans don't use money. They don't believe in money. Whenever they trade in goods. They don't trade in cash or dollars. So the problem is the Native Americans would start to become dependent upon the US government. And again, that's what the US government wants. They don't want the Native Americans to be independent. They want them to be dependent upon US handouts and cash and money handouts. The US government did also, they had to agree that they wouldn't build on the land put aside for the Native Americans. And if the Native Americans thought the US government were breaking this treaty, they wouldn't pay them compensation. The US government will break this treaty. They will build land settlements on Native American land. The idea is that bit by bit, Native American land is going to shrink, and they're going to get put on the reservations. So this is a kind of turn that the US government just ignore, really. Finally, what they decide to do is they split the Native Americans into territories. They are a nomadic people. They don't have territory as such. They have buffalo hunting grounds that they use, and they move from place to place. They follow the buffalo. Well, the US government want to put an end to that, and they have designated territories for the 8 major tribes, like the Sioux and like the Cheyenne. Again, destroying their way of life, and that's the key message for the significance here. The long-term significance of the treaty here is the Native Americans will become dependent. They will lose their independence, and they will lose their way of life and their tradition and their culture. Eventually, settlements will be bought and built upon Native American land. The Native Americans will be put on reservations, and their territory, being designated territory, means that it's the United States who are dictating this treaty. So, although the lesson is quite short, the main analysis is really important here about the significance of this treaty. It's the fact that the US government have complete control. The US government are dictating the terms of the treaty, and they are more favourable to the United States. As a result of the Fort Laramie Treaty, they are able to build railroads, they are able to build settlements, they're able to encourage migration west. On the Native American point of view, they're becoming dependent on US cash handouts. They are subsiding their land, and they are allowing themselves to have their way of life destroyed by moving onto the reservations. So the last thing you need to do is write up this analysis, and what kind of writing up what the significance of this treaty is. It's really important. The last thing to do, and some of you would have already done a lot of this already, obviously do the lesson summary, but it's the knowledge grid at the end. You should be able to do all of these based on this booklet. We talked about Chinese migrants as well with the Law and Order, and the cattle ranching in Texas is from booklet 2, but some of you may have already done booklet 2, so you should be able to do that as well. The idea that ranching in Texas had already been taking place before Texas became a state. Right, so that's booklet 1. So you need to make sure that you've gone over these lessons, and obviously use the video to help with anything that's missing. But that is all booklet 1 now. Okay, thank you.